Good morning and welcome everyone in section B, which focuses on mental health related issues relevant to serving military members. My name is Andrea Tuka and I am the National Psychiatry Practice Leader in the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm speaking to you from Vancouver, BC. So first, I want to acknowledge that I am on the traditional unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. As a moderator, my role is to help to facilitate the discussion with your questions after each presentation. We have each presentations in this section, which are pre-recorded, and each presentation is 15 minutes long. We have 5-minute question period after each presentation, so I encourage you to please forward your questions in the chat function during the presentation or right after the presentation, and I try to relay as many questions as time allows. We will take a 5-minute break after the second and after the 5th presentation. As you know, the presentations will be available 24 hours after the live presentation at the CIMVHR forum platform until 5th of November, and then you can access them at the CIMVHR YouTube channel. I would like to thank to the researchers developing the interest and taking the initiative to look at the different areas or problems where more information and understanding would enhance the well-being and resilience of our members, improve their recovery with more effective treatments, leading to a healthy and ready Canadian Armed Forces. In this section, we will hear about new research findings on different topics pertinent to our serving members, including new innovative treatment modalities on PTSD, features of cannabis and alcohol use in the military sexual trauma, and need for care and barriers to mental health support, as well as the health characteristics of recruits. Again, many thanks to the presenters, whom I will introduce at the beginning of the presentations, and thanks to the universities and organizations, the Queen University, Western University, University of Manitoba, and University of Alberta, the Department of National Defense, the McDonald Franklin OSI Research Center, and the Heroes in Mind Advocacy Research Consortium for supporting the researchers' efforts in this meaningful work. And also special thanks to CIMVHR for hosting this great session. To begin, I am pleased to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Stacy Sillins, who is a defense scientist at the Department of National Defense, and her presentation related to military sexual trauma.
So before we start, I'll confirm that I have no relationships to disclose. Next slide, please. No commercial support to disclose. Next slide. And subsequently, no need to mitigate any bias. Next slide. To summarize this slide, when we're finished today, I hope that you'll come away with a greater understanding of some of the ways sexual misconduct impacts people in the Canadian Armed Forces. Next slide, please. And if anyone would like more information about the presentations and reports that we've drawn on for today's discussion, please let me know. Next slide. So my name is Stacy Sillins, and I'm a researcher with the Department of National Defense. Today's presentation will focus on the lived experiences of those affected by sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. I've had the opportunity to speak about this topic with various stakeholders, both inside and outside the CAF over the last few years, but this is my first time bringing this important work to CIMVHR. I'm always very grateful to have another opportunity to share what we've heard, so I appreciate having your attention today. Before I start, I do want to say that while I won't be sharing any details of sexual violence in this presentation, I will be sharing quotes from our participants that describe their difficulties and their challenges. The topic can be a difficult one, so I encourage everyone to please take care while listening. Next slide, please. Today's findings are pulled from a large qualitative study that we conducted several years ago. It was part of the Operation Honor program of research, and the goal was to invite people to share their experiences after they had been affected by an incident of sexual misconduct. These interviews were incredibly powerful. We went in thinking that we were going to focus on specific support services, but in the process, we heard about what it really means when someone in uniform has been affected by sexual misconduct. These interviews were often testimonies to entire careers or about entire careers. And we heard views on CAF culture, various ways people were affected, and how institutional responses can help, but how they can also create secondary harm. So today, I'd like to share some of what we heard in this regard. Next slide, please. We collected our data via one-on-one semi-structured interviews. The target sample included acting and retired CAF members who experienced an incident of sexual misconduct while serving. We invited men and women from all ranks and from all regions of Canada. The analysis that we used was a type of thematic analysis called template analysis, which allowed us to apply some broad a priori categories that we needed to focus on, but it also allowed us some flexibility in coding emerging and more nuanced subthemes. Next slide, please. We ended up interviewing 67 participants between January and June 2018. 56 were interviewed in person and 11 were interviewed by phone, and you can see the locations of the in-person interviews on the map. Our sample was mostly women, but we did interview 8 men. Almost 3/4 of the sample were reg force, and almost 2/3 were serving at the time of the interview, although a few were in transition. We had a wide range in terms of age and years of service, including young CAF members who were barely out of basic training and some with decades and decades of service under their belts. We also heard from all rank groups, but almost half were junior non-commissioned members at the time of the interview. Next slide, please. Based on the breadth of these interviews, it would be impossible to summarize the findings of this study in 15 minutes. So I'd like to focus on a few important points. First, all of our participants described how their experiences impacted them, and it became clear that sexual misconduct, like many forms of sexual violence, impacted their lives in numerous ways. This graphic represents the different types of impacts that we heard about during our interviews. Some of you may recognize these domains as those you might see in various models of well-being. It's fair to say that many of our participants were impacted in every aspect of their lives. Secondly, many of these impacts emerged as the result of the sexual misconduct event or events. But we also noted that these impacts often emerged or were exacerbated in the aftermath of these events, particularly in the context of the institutional response. So this included experiences participants had when seeking health and particularly mental health care, engaging with investigative and judicial systems, accessing existing resources for support, or just going about their day-to-day activities in the work environment. Unfortunately, almost every participant who we spoke with described having negative experiences after sexual misconduct, either because of reported gaps in services or having to navigate challenges or challenging situations while seeking support in these contexts. So this is what we'll be focusing on today. Next slide, please. These represent some of the more common barriers that our participants navigated in the aftermath of sexual misconduct. This list isn't exhaustive and we don't have time to go over them, but many of them are discussed in the report that we've published on the Operation Honor website. I'd like instead to spend the next several slides highlighting some examples of how barriers and challenges getting support after sexual misconduct had created these harms. Next slide, please. First, we found that insufficient institutional responses can worsen or create additional trauma for affected persons. Examples in which we saw this included when participants couldn't access specialized mental health care or mental health treatment for military sexual trauma, when participants were subjected to insensitive questioning from CAF representatives, or when service providers seem to lack the proper training in trauma-informed care. The quote on the left is one example of this. The participant said, "And while I was there, I just thought of supervisor mocking me and like, why am I even doing this? I don't even want to go back to cadets. I just wanted to die." In some cases, participants were harassed or bullied by their peers or chain of command with no recourse. And many of our participants had ongoing contact with their perpetrators, either in the same unit or on the same base. In other cases, participants were terrified that a change in posting could bring them face to face with their perpetrator. And this was the case for the participant on the right, who did have ongoing contact with her perpetrator. She said, "I've asked to be posted off base." And they're like, "Nope, no money in the budget." And I'm like, "You know what's going on, right?" And they are like, "Yeah, but there's no money in the budget. So I'm forced every day on the base with my attacker. That's why I put in for JPSU, and that's why I work 3 days a week." Next slide, please. We also heard many participants talk about how their careers had been interrupted or irreparably damaged by these experiences. For example, those who could not get proper mental health treatment struggled to perform effectively at work. The quote on the left of the screen is from a woman who was put on a temporary category while she waited for treatment. She said, "I've been on a TCAT for almost 6 months. I've not started my therapy yet because of the lineup. My career is on hold until this happens." And when we spoke, she was actually on her second TCAT, and she was still waiting, and she was afraid that she was going to be put on a permanent category because of this delay. Other participants noted that their careers had suffered because the chain of command wasn't supportive. One common challenge emerged when participants were seeking accommodations because their work environment felt unsafe because of the sexual violence they had endured. Many participants were unable to get these accommodations, or they had to make concessions or sacrifices to stay safe. In the example on the right, the participant asked to defer some exams because she had to testify in court against her attacker. She said, "It was my second year, second term. You're going to court Monday. So we were told, you'll write all your exams the Saturday and Sunday, all 6 exams. You'll write that weekend and be in court Monday. I wrote the exams Saturday, Sunday, all 6 of them. I failed academically." Next slide, please. Sadly, some of the participants we spoke with had released from the military or were releasing because of their experiences. Several talked about how their views of the CAF had changed, and they no longer felt like they had a place within the institution. And this was very painful for these participants. Both of these quotes are from women who released because of what happened. Both of these women had wanted to serve, but had endured several challenges after they reported their sexual misconduct. So the first said, "I believed in it. I was so proud, and then it just got destroyed because this uniform, I was ashamed of it." And the other said, "It's changed my view of the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm being triggered by the fact that I see uniforms, and I'm like, I don't believe them anymore. I don't like them anymore. I don't like the culture." And I just want to point out how both of them refer to how they see the uniform here. The negative experiences they had actually changed the way they saw the entire institution and their place in it, and they couldn't identify with it anymore. Next slide, please. It's important to acknowledge the importance of considering organizational factors and how they can add a layer of complexity in meeting the needs of affected persons. There's a great deal that we could talk about here, but I'd like to highlight a few aspects of CAF culture and structure that were relevant in our participants' experiences. First, the role of gender and masculinity in particular. Several participants discussed the various challenges of being a woman in the CAF, which remains a male-dominated organization. But on the flip side, the men who we spoke with talked about how people see sexual misconduct as a woman's issue and how that impacts their own experiences seeking support. It also became clear that loyalties can really divide a unit. This can have negative ramifications for the affected person, but also for the other peers within a unit and their chain of command as well. Some participants also expressed challenges getting effective support based on elements of CAF organizational structure. So for instance, participants discussed the difficulty of maintaining space from their perpetrators because of how interconnected social networks and trades can be in the CAF. Also, changing locations or trades can be difficult because of staffing or operational requirements. And a few participants discussed how occupational rank and power imbalances impacted their comfort in reporting or their ability to advocate for themselves or for others. And this was especially true of those in junior ranks or those whose perpetrators were in higher ranks. Next slide, please. So how can the CAF address these issues? The suggestions you see here are a summary of the reported needs that were taken from our interviews. These are things that participants said made a difference for them or would have made a difference for them. I don't have time to explain each one, but I did bold a few that are relevant to what we discussed today. Meeting these needs would help build institutional trust. It would help improve transparency and impartiality of organizational responses, and help restore perceptions of equity and fairness among those who are harmed by sexual misconduct, either directly or in the aftermath. Next slide, please. While the overwhelming majority of our participants faced several challenges seeking support, the good news is that most of them also had at least one positive experience with a CAF representative or someone in their chain of command. We also had a few participants who did have good overall experiences. While this was a small minority of our sample, these interviews were so important because they revealed just how powerful an effective supportive response can be. I'm running out of time, so I won't read them, but all three of these quotes are great examples of how harm is mitigated by these positive experiences. Next slide, please. So the important things to take away from today's presentation are to recognize that sexual misconduct impacts many facets of people's lives, and that these negative consequences can be made much worse when people face gaps in services or challenges seeking support. In order to improve support, many gaps and challenges must be addressed, and it will be important to consider how various elements of CAF culture and structure might complicate or create additional challenges for effective institutional response. Next slide, please. Finally, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that these findings have informed or will be informing several CAF-related activities and strategies, which you see listed here. All of these activities will have the potential to improve CAF responses and mitigate some of the harms that we discussed today. And finally, there's always more work to be done, and I think that in terms of research, it would be wise to consider the impacts and needs of some specific subgroups, which were not well represented in these findings. So this includes the needs of veterans after leaving the military, and the specific challenges faced by reservists, individuals in the LGBTQ+ community, and racialized individuals. Last slide, please. Thank you very much for your time today. I would like to thank and acknowledge the participants in our study for their courage coming forward and helping us try to make the CAF safer for everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Siliens, for this very insightful presentation with lots of meaningful information. Thank you for summarizing the steps ahead, what we have to do. Yes, it was very, very timely. I can reassure you that we have been working hard in health services as well to address some of those difficulties and needs. Just to give you an example, we are actually preparing a training a professional day about military sexual trauma in the early winter. So thank you again. So let's see that, do we have any questions what we can address? One question that can you share some of the key differences you heard in your interviews when participant had a positive experience getting support, and what was different about those experiences?
Sure. Of course, every experience is different, but absolutely we did see a few key features that came up again and again when people reported having positive experiences or interactions with people. I would say probably one of the most important things is people having someone who can advocate for them. So feeling like somebody is actually in your corner and on your side is really important, especially when your rank might get in the way of your power dynamic with others. So people using their authority, leveraging their authority to help, that was really important. Another important thing was having flexible options to meet your needs. So it's not always possible to provide exactly what somebody needs in a particular moment. But what made a big difference for people was knowing that the person they were seeking support from was willing to work with them, had their best interests at heart, and was trying to find options that would address their concerns. So that was really important. And really, ultimately, at the base of all of this, the foundation of all of this, were people being treated with compassion. So even when things aren't going to work out for somebody, when they're going through the system, when they're hitting barriers, knowing that the person across from them cares and empathizes and genuinely wants to help, that made a huge difference for people. And it's something very simple at its core, is really just, are people being treated with compassion?
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Silins. Yes, and I think it's important to build on those positive inputs, positive experiences, because if you know that this made a difference, those things made a difference for people, those are the things what we need to build on. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome.
So there is another question. You mentioned access to specialized mental health care. Does this mean dealing with delay to existing care or care targeted to sexual misconduct? It's an excellent question.
Sorry, is the question, is that what I mean, what they mean by specialized mental health care?
Yes. So does this mean dealing with delay to an existing care or care targeted to sexual misconduct?
You know what? It's actually both, very much both, and they're linked. So we did hear, even in our interviews with people who were dealing with issues more recently, even in the last few years, that there is a lack of specialized mental health care for people with military sexual trauma in particular. And that was a very important barrier for a lot of people. In the CAF, we have, we're getting better at treating combat trauma, and we're getting better at having specialized care for that. But there are special features, there are significant, unique requirements and needs for people who are suffering from military sexual trauma. And there is a lack. There, according to our participants, there was a lot of barriers trying to access that care. And because of that, there were often barriers or long delays to access that care. So people, I think I had a quote up there where somebody was on their second TCAT waiting to finally be put in touch with somebody who specialized in military sexual trauma. This is a particular issue among reservists as well, who have to access civilian services, and civilian services often don't understand the military aspects of military sexual trauma. So yeah, that's one of the biggest barriers that we're facing, actually.
Thank you very much. Excellent question. I made a note of that, and we try to work on it. Absolutely. Thank you very much, Dr. Silins, for the great presentation again. And we are now moving on to our second presentation, which will be by Jennifer Bourne, who is also a defense scientist at Department of National Defense. And she will share her research about Operation Laser, regarding perceived need for help and barriers to mental health support. So please welcome Jennifer Bourne.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jennifer Bourne, and I'm a researcher with CIMVHR in Ottawa. And today, on behalf of my co-authors, we're going to present some results on the OP-LASER study. This is government-funded research, so I have no commercial interest to report. I have no conflicts of interest to report. And the study was approved through went through ethics approval before. The learning objectives for the study is to be able to describe the barriers associated with accessing care in the population. And here are the references we used to develop this slide deck. As part of Canada's response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and following an agreement with the provincial and federal governments, Canadian Armed Forces personnel, approximately 3,000 of them, were deployed to long-term care facilities in Ontario and Quebec. The roles that the Canadian Forces members played, as expected, included medical personnel deployed inside the long-term care facilities. But in addition, medical personnel were also deployed outside the long-term care facilities in more of a support role. Non-healthcare providers in support roles were also deployed inside the long-term care facilities and outside the long-term care facilities. What we know is that there were some of the long-term care facilities that had some dire circumstances that exposed personnel to multiple stressors. And these stressors could have been potentially traumatizing or morally injurious. So previous deployments where we've looked at healthcare personnel being exposed to moral stressors have often been international deployments. So the OP-LASER study was set up to look at the factors that promote psychological well-being following this domestic crisis. In this presentation, I'm going to go over the survey results from time 2 of the data collection. This was about 6 months after the deployment, and I'm going to detail some of the information about needs for care and obstacles to seeking care. Next slide. The OP-LASER survey was a census of all Canadian Forces personnel that deployed on OP-LASER as of 27th of April, 2020. We measured objective needs for care, mental health service use, and some factors of barriers and morality items that could affect accessing care. The objective need for care was measured at all 3 time points using validated scales. Subjective need for care, mental health care service use, and barriers were measured at T3. In this presentation, I'm going to show you some of the descriptive statistics that explore the objective and subjective needs for care, as well as the type of barriers sought, and then provide some regression results about some of the raw associations and some more complex models that bring together all the results to see which factors are independently associated with accessing help. Next slide. At time 2, the majority of the survey respondents were male, junior NCMs, and medical trades deployed inside long-term care facilities. The minority of these respondents indicated that they had a perceived need for care. And overall, respondents did not have an objective need for mental health services. As you can see below in the 3 graphs, the results of the 3 objective scales that we use to look at objective needs. So we have the PHQ for depression, the GAD for anxiety, and the PLC for PTSD, potential or probable screen. Next slide. This table presents the results of logistic regression models. The first model here shows that perceived need is a predictor of accessing care. And then the second model brings in objective need as well. So adding objective need to the model did not increase the model fit. So that implies that when controlling for one's perceived need for care, their score on the anxiety, depression, and PTSD scales were not significantly associated with accessing care more often. Next slide. In addition to looking at needs for care, we also looked at barriers to care. Here we have the barriers that we looked at in this study. they're broken up into the CIMVHR model. So capabilities, opportunities, and motivation. In this study, we looked at one item or one factor related to capability, one related to motivation, and six related to motivation, two related to opportunity, an additional two related to morals. Because of the experiences reported on this operation, we added some barrier items related to discomfort asking for help, and also regarding the desire to avoid revisiting difficult or stressful experiences. These are colored in teal because we think these will probably fall under motivation, but we need to do some more testing to see exactly where these fit in the model. Next slide. So here we have the results of the univariate analysis. So all the CIMVHR models, or most of the CIMVHR models, and all the moral factors were associated with accessing mental health services. The gray boxes show the relationship with any mental health service use. The white boxes for any non-professional mental health service use, and then the black boxes are professional health service use. And these are all in comparison to no mental health service use. The first box at the top, the blue dashes up there, shows that, interestingly, when you look at staffing and workload resource barriers, discomfort accessing care at work, and concerns about confidentiality, these resources are actually significantly more likely, those who reported these barriers were more likely to access care, professional care in particular. And then at the bottom, we have the factors related to moral reasons for not accessing care. And similarly, those who reported the barriers were more likely to have accessed care, but here we see that the relationship was stronger for accessing professional services. Next slide. Here we have the results for the final model we developed. In this model, we included perceived need and select barrier and moral issues. These were chosen based on the univariate analysis we did earlier. So perceived need remained a strong predictor of accessing mental health services, but when controlling for perceived need, only barriers related to staffing and workload resources were significant predictors of accessing care. The odds of accessing care by those who endorse staffing and workload resources were approximately 3 to 4 times higher than the odds for those who did not report these barriers. Next slide. Looking at the results a different way, here we have a graph that shows the proportion of individuals that endorse the barriers, but broken down based on if they needed care and if they actually sought care. So the maroon bars indicate those who had a perceived need for care but did not access support. The green bars are those who had a perceived need for care and did access support, while the gray bars are those who did not have a perceived need for care. Overall, the barriers related to motivation and physical opportunity were more endorsed than those related to capability and social opportunity. And those without a perceived need for care, the gray bars, reported more barriers related to resources than those with a perceived need for care, the green and the maroon bars. And those with a perceived need for care who did access support, the green bars, were more likely to report motivational barriers as well. So an interesting finding I want to draw your attention to is in the blue dash box there. And we're very concerned about those, the maroon bar here, because these are the people who had a need for care but did not access care. And as you can see, these individuals were much more likely to report the self-treatment option. So this could be because, and especially compared to those who sought care with a perceived need. So this might be because those with the green bars, those with a perceived need had much stronger symptoms. So they may have needed to access care, and potentially those with the maroon bar had weaker symptoms. So potentially self-treatment was a valid option. But in other research, we've looked at healthcare providers' actions when faced with mental health. And when we're presented with scenarios with severe mental health symptoms, healthcare providers in the CAF, between 40 and 60% indicate that they wouldn't access care, despite the scenario indicates that they should. Next slide. So in summary, most of those who recognized that they had a need for care sought care. Yet we are concerned about that group who had a need for care but did not access it, and potentially those who are self-treating. Second, we found that those that reported barriers were more likely to access care. This is not intuitive. Reporting a barrier is not associated with seeking support, but we're not the first study to come up with this. Other studies have found, other studies of American populations have found that those that access care more report more barriers. And similarly, this may be because in our study, those who access care had an increased need for care. And studies of Western militaries have consistently found that those with mental health care or mental health needs do report more barriers. And this could be because of their mental health condition might increase stigmatizing beliefs within the individual, or it could be due to the fact that they've tried to access care really makes the barriers a lot more salient in that group of people. A third interesting finding we came up with was that the association of motivation and resource barriers with accessing non-professional services was stronger than the association with accessing professional services. So this may suggest that the barriers are steering people away from professional services towards non-professional services, or perhaps because of the timing of our survey, non-professional services like talking to a friend, a colleague, or a family member were more easily accessible because this survey was post-deployment during a pandemic. And finally, we're not able to make any conclusions about the direction of causality. Barrier perceptions could impact service use, but service use could also impact barrier perceptions. And because this survey was cross-sectional, we're not able to discern which way that relationship is going. So we do need some more research that includes better baseline data of perceived barriers and mental health outcomes. Next slide. So in conclusion, there are multiple steps and decision points in the path to accessing care. Both the symptoms you experience and your perception of them, so both your objective need and your perceived need, can influence where you are on the pathway. And depending where you find yourself on this pathway, you may perceive and experience barriers differently. These barriers influence whether or not you seek care, but once you seek care, or seeking care itself can in turn influence the barriers. So again, this highlights the point that there's a need for prospective mixed model studies to disentangle these findings. And once we get a better idea of the nature of this relationship, we'll be able to tailor persuasive messaging in our mental health and educational efforts to increase access to mental health care for those that need it. Next slide. This is just a caveat I want to bring up. Basically, it's, the results we presented here aren't weighted, so they represent the findings in the respondents, and they cannot be necessarily generalized to the entire op laser population. Next slide. Finally, I'd like to thank my co-authors, everyone from the op laser research team, and all those who supported this research. Most importantly, I'd like to thank the study participants for giving their time and their data to provide the results for you today. So thank you very much. And there's my email address if you want to contact me with any questions.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for this excellent and very, very interesting presentation. I think many of us have been very, very curious that how those service members did who participated in this very unique but very demanding operation of laser. So let's see that is there any questions? I don't see so far from the audience, so I would like to know that what else did the op laser survey cover beyond access and barriers to care?
Thank you very much for your question. The survey was a look at a lot of the resilience and risk factors. So there's some organizational factors, some individual factors, in addition to the mental health outcomes. And a lot of these are discussed, particularly moral injury. There was a lot of data collected on moral injury. So there are actually two poster presentations available, one on moral injury and one on the risk and resilience factors and their predictions of probable mental health outcomes that you can go look at for more information on what was covered in the survey. It was a huge survey, so there's a lot in it, and we can't cover it all in this one presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. Another question that what will be the next steps to explore the moral injury you just mentioned as a barrier to care?
The moral injury piece, we just added it. So we really need to understand kind of mathematically how those barriers are working in our models. So we do have a survey plan to look at barriers to care in the entire CAF population. And in that survey, we will include those mental health care and physical health care barriers related to moral injury. And we're going to then be able to do some more work on the models to see where they fit and if they are in fact unique factors going forward. One of the main things that came out of this research is that context is important. So understanding moral injury in terms of post-operation is going to be a very different thing than looking at it though in an entire population of people who may or may not have a recent moral injury, or their moral injuries may be existing from a different operation or a different something that happened in their personal life.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you. So we do not have any more questions. So we will go, as I mentioned, to our first break because we have these two excellent presentations. So we will break for 5 minutes, and now we are 18. Sorry, I mean, as I said, in Vancouver time, so it's 11:19 in Ottawa time. So let's come back in 5 minutes, 11:25. Thank you. So welcome back, everyone. We will continue with our presentations. And the next one will be from Ashley Forsyth from Queen's University. Welcome, Ashley, and she will talk about a novel short-term PTSD treatment.
I have nothing to disclose and no relationships with commercial interests. This program has received financial support from Project Trauma Support in the form of $5,000 for the analysis of this program. Ashley Forsyth has received no funding from Project Trauma Support, whose products are being discussed in this program. Next slide. Mitigating potential bias is not applicable. Next slide. At the conclusion of this presentation, participants will be able to A, comprehend and describe this novel intervention, B, evaluate the utility of a multimodal treatment approach and its application in a diverse population, and C, translate this knowledge to inform their own practices or future PTSD intervention programs or evaluations. Next slide. Here's a list of my references for this presentation. Next slide. Good morning. Thank you everyone for being here. My name is Ashley Forsyth, and I'm a third-year PhD student at the Center for Neuroscience Studies at Queen's University, and my supervisor is Dr. Diane Grohl. We are currently conducting a program evaluation of an in-house post-traumatic stress disorder and operational stress injury treatment program in Ontario. Next slide. For many years, the spotlight on post-traumatic stress disorder has focused primarily on military personnel. However, we've become increasingly aware that public safety personnel are also at risk for developing PTSD through their professional activities. Public safety personnel include individuals working in firefighting, paramedic services, policing, and correctional services. Operational stress injury is an umbrella term describing many issues, not only post-traumatic stress disorder, but also major depressive disorder, anxiety, sleep, and anger issues. The prevalence of current and lifetime PTSD reported among the Canadian military ranges from 5 to 8%, with some deployments reporting as high as 35%. Among public safety personnel, it has been estimated that rates are between 10 and 35%, but could go as high as 45%. Next slide. The Blue Paper, developed by the Canadian Institute for Public Safety Research and Treatment, reviewed the effectiveness of several programs aimed at supporting the psychological well-being of public safety personnel. The Blue Paper has several critical outcomes. They identified peer support and crisis-focused psychological intervention programs used by first responder agencies. They reviewed existing research from both national and international sources, and they evaluated the evidence for the effectiveness of several of these programs. The results from this review found that there is little evidence supporting or refuting the effectiveness of such programs. They further call for more methodologically rigorous studies that evaluate the effectiveness of such programs. Next slide. An additional study by Movember, a leading funder of suicide prevention and early intervention programs, reviewed mental health initiatives from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. This report examined scientific research supporting prevention and intervention programs. They consulted with subject matter experts within each community and explored social media sites for additional program information. Major findings from this report state that there is little evidence of the overall effectiveness when it comes to psychoeducation and skills-based programming. They concluded that many of the programs being implemented were not being validated, and too much emphasis was being put on the employees to cope with their own traumatic aspects of their job. Next slide. It is now known that PTSD can affect a broad range of professions, but there is evidence demonstrating that little is known about the effectiveness of PTSD treatment programs for these populations. Therefore, we asked, is this program an effective intervention for armed forces and public safety personnel with post-traumatic stress disorder? Additionally, we asked, are there differences in outcomes between male and female participants? Is there a difference in outcomes among occupations? Is there an association between the experience of early childhood trauma and operational stress injury symptoms? And finally, what are the differences in outcomes post-intervention and at 3, 6, and 12 months? Next slide. In response to the need to better identify and understand current PTSD treatment programs in Canada, we are conducting an evaluation of a novel program in Ontario. The program we are evaluating aims to promote the connection between uniformed professionals, including active military and veterans, firefighters, paramedic, police and RCMP, and correctional officers. In doing so, the program intends to help participants transition from post-traumatic stress to post-traumatic growth. Both post-traumatic growth describes the personal transformational shift from trauma to personal growth that some individuals can experience. The goal of this program is to provide timely access to care and deliver help to those suffering from service-related trauma. The program aim is to support their colleagues to minimize their distress and help them to remain active and healthy in their lives. Next slide. This is a 6-day program with scheduled programming each day. The team consists of physicians with experience in mental health counseling, as well as lived experience with military and medical expertise. Each day includes different programming, starting with physical therapy and meditation. It also includes group and individual psychotherapy, breathwork, art therapy, labyrinth exploration, music therapy, equine-assisted learning, and high rope adventures, as well as team building. The atmosphere is intended to promote peer connection and support by being very similar to that experienced in military basic training or police academy. The focus of this program is to provide a safe environment where emotions may be expressed in the presence of colleagues who provide support through shared experiences. Next slide. We used a longitudinal, quasi-experimental mixed methods approach as it is the most pragmatic approach to conducting program evaluations, allowing researchers to utilize all approaches available that promote a deeper and richer understanding of the data. Participants were recruited between 2018 and 2020 following a pre-screening assessment which was conducted by their primary healthcare providers as well as by program administrators. The program takes in cohorts of up to 12 individuals comprised of all male or all female groups, each with a complement of military and first responder participants, including firefighters, paramedics, police officers, corrections, and they may come from anywhere in Canada. Individuals must have a pre-existing condition of PTSD and can self-refer or be referred by a mental health practitioner. Participants were excluded if they had any active substance or alcohol abuse, psychosis, violent tendencies, or significant access to diagnoses. Next slide. For phase 1 of this research, questionnaires were administered immediately before the program, immediately after the program, then at 3, 6, and 12-month intervals following program completion. Demographic information was also collected, which included occupation, employment status, medical and psychiatric diagnoses, as well as medications and healthcare utilization. At baseline, immediately before the program, participants completed the Adverse Childhood Exposure Questionnaire and the Lifetime Events Checklist. Additional scales taken at all points, including baseline, were the McGill Pain Questionnaire, Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder Checklist, Patient Health Questionnaire, Medical Outcomes Survey, Pittsburgh Sleep Index, Dimensions of Anger, and the Anxiety Sensitivity Scale. Our analysis of this data is currently underway. Next slide. For phase 2 of this research, we conducted semi-structured interviews and anticipate the analysis to start early next year. At the 12-month completion point of quantitative data collection, we asked participants if they wish to further participate in the study. By applying a semi-grounded theoretical approach, we will ensure participants have a descriptive voice and will be able to analyze and interpret meanings as well as explore relationships between concepts. This process allows for the data to speak for itself and allows researchers to gain a deeper understanding of how participants engaged with the program and how they feel it has impacted their life. We'll construct a codebook to assist with the in-depth analysis, comparison of accounts, and from that, we'll be able to identify emerging themes within the data. Next slide. We collected quite a bit of demographic information, so I'll provide a brief overview of some key areas. In all, 11 cohorts were given an invitation to participate in the study. There were a total of 111 participants who completed the baseline questionnaire and demographic information. As you can see, study respondents were mostly male. The average age for participants was 44.9 years, and most participants were either married or in common law relationships. We also collected information about physical health conditions, medications being taken, as well as healthcare utilization, such as psychiatric visits and frequency. Next slide. Nearly half of participants indicated that their current occupation type was either veteran or active military, with the largest group in policing, either provincial service or RCMP, while firefighters and paramedics, as well as corrections, make up only a small portion of respondents. A small subgroup indicated that they had experience with one or more occupations, which typically included military service. As you can see, there was a fairly even distribution between individuals who were working full-time, part-time, and those on leave. Next slide. We have early results from the quantitative data of all measures, and I'll provide a brief overview of some of our findings. We started with an N of 111 respondents at baseline. However, there were dropouts between baseline and 12-month follow-up. At the 12-month point, 47 participants had completed questionnaires at all time points, so the overall dropout rate was approximately 50% from baseline to 12 months. These are the outcomes of the PTSD scale and the depression scales. The top green column shows the positive diagnosis screen for all participants, and the lower blue and red are grouped into gender. In both the PTSD and depression scale, we see very high positive diagnoses or scores for each condition at baseline, and a significant decrease in positive screen at the post-course data collection. This effect seems to be sustained at the 3 and 6 month follow-ups and at the 12-month follow-up. Results from the remaining measures, sleep, anger, anxiety, pain, and medical outcomes, show similar results. However, analysis is ongoing, therefore no conclusions can be reached at this time. Next slide. In addition to the scales, participants were asked to provide their comments about program at follow-up. Many reported positive responses, but there were some less than positive responses as well. A total of 22 participants completed interviews. During the interviews, we asked questions about their lives before attending the program, how they experienced the program, and how they reflect on those experiences today. These are some samples from the participants. As you can see, there was a range of experiences, so I'll just read a couple of them. Since attending the program, my life has done a complete 180. I have hope, feel at peace, and I'm finally gaining traction to get my life back. This has been life-changing for me in the best possible way. contrasted with, I can tell you that in no way did the program help me. It actually set me back months in treatment. Next slide. There were some strengths and limitations with the current study. Strengths were that we used widely known and validated psychometric instruments. By using a range of measures, we can identify patterns in the data. Also, the mixed methods approach in program evaluation can improve the rigor of research. Some limitations include that the sample was not randomized. Some participants were lost to follow-up, therefore data may not be representative of all participants during this time. Also, the scales we used were non-medical diagnoses. There are possible risks for bias as well, including selection bias. So participants involved in the study may be at higher risk for other mental health conditions, and also historical bias. So the possibility that events that occurred during the intervention can affect the results. Next slide. Future studies should consider using validated outcome measures and formal reporting methods, such as peer-reviewed publications, test programs among a diverse population, which includes military and public safety personnel. There is a need for larger, high-quality studies with longer-term follow-up to assess stability and maintenance of outcomes. Further investigation may be warranted into the utilization of complementary and alternative medicine practices in Canada by military and public safety personnel and the role they play as adjunctive therapies. Next slide. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you very much, Ashley, for this excellent overview. I think it's very timely and it's very needed to actually evaluate the PTSD treatment programs in general, but it was great to hear about this initiative. Could you please expand a little bit on the role of the complementary and alternative medicine practices, and why do you feel that more research needed in this area, as you used it in your treatment program as well?
Thank you for that question. So from what I found in my research, there's an abundance of different programs and treatments available that individuals can self-refer to, simple Google searches, that kind of thing. But there's very little research to back it up. And that doesn't mean that these aren't evidence-based practices, but we don't have these, the evidence for this in a lot of peer-reviewed publications. So there's lots, like I say, lots of evidence base for things like yoga, meditation, wilderness-based programs. But again, we need to find a way to get that information, not just to the individuals, but to the people in the organizations, so they can make more informed decisions.
Yeah, it's true. And I think all of us know that for trauma, so for individuals with trauma exposure or even PTSD, they really like and find it easily accessible and not as threatening to use those treatment modalities than the manualized evidence-based psychotherapy. So it's good. Yeah. So there is a question also that very interesting and promising results. What proportion of respondents provided negative qualitative feedback? And are there any hints as to what might characterize this group?
So thank you for the question. So most of the respondents, so just to be clear, I haven't done the analysis yet on the qualitative data, but for the most part, people who responded and agreed to participate had positive responses to the program. So I can't speak for those individuals that didn't have positive responses because they generally did not agree to participate in the interview.
Okay. And thank you very much. Can you discuss a little bit the utility of multi-modal approach to PTSD treatment?
Sure, thank you. So I've recently conducted a systematic review of programs that are available in Canada, and many of them utilized more than two approaches to treatment within their programs. So we know, or I found in my research, that the most the most successful process in treating PTSD is through a combination of drug therapy and psychotherapy. However, that's only about 50 to 60%, so that we're still missing a large proportion of individuals. So multimodal approach might be able to deal with things like stability and maintenance in between treatments.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Ashley. So thank you again for this great presentation. And we will move to our next presentation from Megan Terrien, who is a defense scientist from Department of National Defense, who will share her research on cannabis consumption in the regular force.
Hi, my name is Megan Terrien, and I am with the Department of National Defense, specifically with the Director General Military Personnel Research and Analysis. And today I'm going to be presenting on cannabis consumption behavior in the regular forces. So I have no commercial interest to disclose, no commercial support, no financial support or in-kind support to disclose, no conflicts of interest, and no potential bias. So by the end of this presentation, you, the audience, should be aware of the overall cannabis use rates among the Canadian Armed Forces, the CAF regular force members. And additionally, you should have a better understanding of the differences in cannabis use based on demographic and military characteristics. So a little bit of background on cannabis use in Canada. So Bill C-45, the Cannabis Act, came into effect in October of 2018. And with it came the legalization in Canada of the purchasing, growing, and consumption of recreational cannabis. As a result of this act, a number of organizations, including DND, had to come up with their own policies and directives related to cannabis use amongst their members. So for DND, this was DAOD 9004-1, also called the use of cannabis by CAF members. It was drafted in response to Bill C-45 and is the directive that really states how cannabis can be used by its members, in what way, and what are the rules and regulations. So it outlines the expectations of the CAF members. The most important thing coming out of it is that it was decided that possession and consumption of cannabis are permitted by CAF members under certain circumstances. So there are some prohibitions before performance of certain duties. So you can imagine that some of the more safety sensitive positions, as an example, have a longer prohibition period than some of the more or less risky desk job. So as a result of, obviously, cannabis legalization, there's been a lot more research that has started to come out on the health effects of cannabis use. We have some from the past as well, but more and more is coming out. Obviously, there are a lot of mitigating factors that have to be considered. The consumption method of cannabis, whether it's smoked versus, say, edibles or topical creams, there's going to be differences there. Whether you're a regular user, a chronic user, or you, somebody is just a user here and there, just for recreational purposes, is going to have differences. But what we do know is that there are some short-term and long-term health effects as a result of cannabis consumption. So these are things like impaired cognitive functioning, potentially problems with motor coordination. There's the possibility of developing schizophrenic symptoms. There's also the possibility of developing cannabis use disorder, amongst other things. So certainly there are some health effects that have to be considered. So the purpose of this study is to determine what the cannabis use rates are among CAF regular force members. Now that we know it is legal, now that we know that our CAF members can use cannabis, we also know that there are health implications. We really want to have an idea of what is the actual rate of use within the CAF. A secondary aim is to look at the different demographic and military characteristics of these users. So the data from the current study came from the Canadian Armed Forces Health Survey, the CAF-HS. This is a population-based survey which is administered about every 4 to 5 years. And you may actually know it as the, formerly known as the HLIS, the Health and Lifestyle Information Survey. It was changed slightly in this most recent iteration to the CAF-HS. This survey was developed by the Directorate of Force Health Protection, which is within the Canadian Forces Health Services. And what its purpose is to really give a snapshot in time of the overall health and well-being of the CAF, what's going on at one time with the members. So the CAFHS was administered electronically in the first half of 2019. This is the most recent iteration. It was administered to 33,000 regular force CAF members. That sample was stratified by sex, by age group. We had 4 different age categories, and by base, with 21 larger bases and then 1 other category, which included smaller bases and areas. Additionally, from that 33,000 regular force CAF members that it was provided to, we had 13,065 regular force members complete the survey. So this is a 40% response rate. So in the survey, there's a lot of items that ask about health and well-being, but they're specifically related to cannabis are 4 items. So the very first item is, during your lifetime, have you ever used or tried cannabis? With response options of yes or no. If you respond no, you do not, the respondent would not actually receive any of the further questions because they really don't apply. If they responded yes, that they have in fact used or tried cannabis at some point in their lifetime, they would get the next 2 items, items 2 and 3 on my slide here. So item 2 being, have you used cannabis just once or more than once? And the answers being just once or more than once. And the purpose of this being to sort of get an idea of those individuals who just tried it that one time, but then never actually continued. They decided it was not for them, versus those that have actually used it on more than one occasion. The third item being, again, for those who indicated they had used cannabis in their lifetime, they would receive the item, during the past 12 months, have you used cannabis? With the answers of yes or no. And as I mentioned, the survey was administered in the early half of 2019. So this would cover some legal period and also some illegal period within that year. The answer of no, again, they wouldn't get the final question because they have not used within the past year. But if they said yes, they would move on to item number 4, which is, in the past 12 months, have you used or tried cannabis for medical purposes? So these are the 4 items that came from the survey that we were able to draw from and use for this particular analysis. So when looking at our participants in the survey, it's fairly typical of the CAF. We have a very predominantly male population, male response rate. And additionally, we have a large group that's within the younger age group. So almost 2/3 of our sample actually were under the age of 40. Additionally, we had just over 2/3 of our sample being non-commissioned members. And the largest group, the largest command unit that responded to this survey came from the Canadian Army, followed by the Royal Canadian Air Force. And then we have responses from the Navy as well as other units, which I'll explain a little bit more what those are later. So when we get into the results, first is the overall proportions. So this is the, again, looking at the whole sample. And on the left-hand side of this slide, that is showing the cannabis use during lifetime question. So that's asking, in your lifetime, have you used cannabis? And everybody receives this item. And what we found was that 64%, nearly 2/3 of our sample, indicated that yes, they had in fact used cannabis at some point in their lifetime. We then took that 64% and they were given those next 2 items. So the first being, have you consumed in the past 12 months? And of that 64% who indicated that yes, they had in fact consumed in their lifetime, we find that just over half have indicated that they'd actually used within the past 12 months. Additionally, we asked the item, have you consumed on more than one occasion? And what we found was that the vast majority, 86%, indicated that they had in fact used consumed cannabis more than one time. So the next 4 graphs that I'm going to present are showing the demographic and military characteristics, so that breakdown. Importantly, and so we're going to be looking at sex, age, rank, and command unit. And what you're looking at here is, on the left-hand side is always the proportion coming from the full sample. So this is the question that asks, in your lifetime, have you used cannabis? The responses are always in the affirmative. So it's the yes, I have in fact used cannabis. So these give the numbers of the proportion of individuals who have used. On the right-hand side is only coming from those individuals who indicated they had used cannabis in their lifetime. So of that, in this case, 64 and 61%, how many have actually, from that, what proportion have used within the past 12 months? So what we're looking at here is males in blue and females in green. And we can see that in lifetime cannabis use and in past 12-month cannabis use, males were more likely to report having consumed cannabis than their female counterparts. This next slide is by age. And so what we're looking at is the youngest age group is the 17 to 29 years. And this is my reference group for this particular work. The next category in sort of the pinkish color is a 30 to 39-year-olds. In green is the 40 to 49-year-olds. And in purple is the 50-year-olds and older. And so what we found is when we looked at lifetime cannabis use, there were no differences between the two youngest age groups. So it's the 17 to 29-year-olds and the 30 to 39-year-olds were reporting similar proportions were reporting cannabis use in their lifetime. However, they were reporting greater cannabis use than their older counterparts. So then the 40 to 49-year-olds and the greater than 50-year-olds. Similar results in the 12-month cannabis use, except that the youngest group was actually statistically different from all three of the older groups. So in this case, the 17 to 29-year-olds who did report that they had consumed cannabis at some point in their lifetime were also more likely to report having consumed in the previous 12 months than all of their older cohorts. So next is looking at cannabis use by rank. So we have junior NCMs as the reference group here. They're in blue. Then there's the senior NCMs, which are in this pinkish color. The junior officers are in green, and the senior officers are in purple. And what we find here is that in lifetime cannabis use, the junior NCMs were more likely to report cannabis consumption than all three other rank groups, and similar findings in the past 12 months. So of those who had reported using cannabis in their lifetime, those junior NCMs were more likely to report having consumed cannabis in the past 12 months than the senior NCMs and both officer groups. And finally, we looked at it by command unit. So in this case, we have Canadian Army as our reference group. So that's the light blue. We then have the Royal Canadian Air Force in red, the Royal Canadian Navy in green, the Military Personnel Command in purple, and this other group in pink. And the other group consisted of all the other command units that were just too small to actually look at on their own. So things like CANSOFCOM, Chief of Defense Staff, Canadian Joint Operations Command, these groups all clumped together. What we found here is that when looking at lifetime cannabis use, we found that the Canadian Army was more likely, individuals from the Canadian Army were more likely to report cannabis use in their lifetime than those of the Royal Canadian Air Force, those of the Military Personnel Command, and those from other command units. When we looked at the past 12-month cannabis use for those who had indicated they had used cannabis in their lifetime, we found that the Canadian Army had reported greater consumption than the Military Personnel Command and the other groups, with no differences between the Royal Canadian Air Force or the Royal Canadian Navy on past 12 months. And there was no difference, obviously, in lifetime cannabis use between the Canadian Army and the Royal Canadian Navy. So the overall findings show that nearly 2/3 of the regular force CAF members reported cannabis use at some point in their lifetime. And of that group who had indicated that they had consumed in their lifetime, just over 1/2 of them indicated that they had consumed within the previous year since the survey was administered, again, in the early half of 2019. Males, NCMs, and those in the younger cohorts were more likely to have consumed cannabis than their peers. So when we compare this with the Canadian general population, the survey I like to use is the 2019 Canadian Cannabis Survey. The reason for this is it was done obviously at a similar time in 2019. It looks at the general population of those aged 16 and older, so very close to our age group, which is 17 and older. And what they found was that 25% of the Canadian general population, aged 16 and older, had reported consuming cannabis in the previous 12 months. Now, the current CAF-HS data that we have isn't directly comparable because it only examines 12-month use amongst those who indicated they had used cannabis in their lifetime. So it's not exactly perfect. Additionally, we have not age or sex matched to the Canadian general population. And this is important because the demographic makeup of the CAF is quite different, which I'll get into. However, crude estimates do indicate that around 1/3 of all CAF regular force members consumed cannabis at some point in the previous 12 months. So this appears higher, 1/3 for CAF regular force members versus the 25% for the Canadian general population. But the apparent higher proportion among CAF members may be explained by the demographic makeup of the CAF. So in particular, the CAF tends to have more males and a much younger population. And the 2019 Canadian Cannabis Survey, if you look at it a little bit further, revealed that there are differences among age groups and among sex, specifically those younger age groups, so the 16 to 19-year-olds and the 20 to 24-year-olds were showing 44% and 51% respectively of cannabis use within the previous year versus the 25-year-olds and older, which only showed 21%. And similar findings were found when you look at males versus females, with males showing higher proportions of 29% than females at 21%. So the younger age and higher proportion of males in the CAF likely contributed to the higher proportions that we see in our particular study. We would need to look further at age and sex matched data in order to properly compare to the Canadian general population. So we do have some limitations. There's only a 40% response rate. This is less than we've had in previous HLIS administrations. So there are possible demographic differences between the responders and the non-responders. Additionally, as with any self-report data, there is social desirability bias that is built in, especially when you're talking about topics that have stigma. So cannabis is an excellent example of that. Even though it is a legal substance now, there is still that stigma that it holds for many groups. Additionally, there's potential confounding nature of other variables. So for instance, I spoke a little bit about the command units, and we saw that the Canadian Army seemed to have higher proportions than some of the other command units. However, the Canadian Army also tends to have higher male representation and younger individuals. And as such, it may be those, and it's probably likely that those variables are in fact contributing in part to those findings. And we haven't yet dove in to look into those specifics. Finally, due to the nature of the data collection, as I already mentioned, it's difficult to compare directly to the Canadian general population. Regardless, we do know that there are CAF members that are consuming cannabis, and we do know that there are potential health effects of this. And as a result, these findings can be used to inform health promotion strategies. And specifically, we can highlight the importance of targeted approaches to those subpopulations with the highest use, so those younger male members. Future research should examine the motivators behind cannabis consumption, however. It's not just about who's using and what can we do about that, but why are they using? Is it for recreational purposes, self-medication, sleep aids, etc.? By being able to better understand the motivators, we might be able to find other strategies that can help our CAF members. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed my presentation, and I will take some questions.
Thank you very much, Megan. It was extremely interesting and very timely information that you shared about cannabis use in the regular force. As a psychiatrist, I can attest that we deal with the health consequences day after day. So we do have a question from the audience. Can you comment about how the response rate may have impacted your study?
Thank you. Yes, so the response rate was actually it is a concern. So we're looking at about a 40% response rate with this survey, when in the past with the HLIS, we've actually had a much higher response rate. So we've been able to use that data and really feel a little bit more confident in it. I can say that the data were weighted so that it is still representative of the important demographics of the military. So there's at least that, but the truth is that less than half of our sample did respond to it. So we have to take it with a grain of salt. We don't know exactly what the differences between that group that did respond and that group that didn't respond are. And it could obviously inflate different numbers in different ways. So it's certainly something that's on our radar as we take this data and hopefully look at, our policies and our programs that we have in the CAF. We are looking also at hopefully collecting more data in the future from other data sources so that we can sort of do some comparisons to see.
Okay, thank you very much. And one more question. How do the results compare to alcohol use in the military, especially in terms of comparison to the Canadian general population? Do we have higher rates in the military?
Sure. So alcohol is typically the drug that is compared most to cannabis, especially now that they're both legal drugs that obviously our members are permitted to use. So we do see a lot of comparisons starting to come out. Obviously, the cannabis research is quite new, but we do know that in terms of alcohol use, there have been studies in the past that have shown that there tends to be, in some cases, higher alcohol use in the military than the general population, although it's typically more that you see higher rates of things like binge drinking. And so not necessarily that more members are consuming than the general population, but more that we're seeing sort of these risky alcohol behaviors are coming out a little bit more. So I mean, in that sense, it's a bit comparable to what we're seeing, but there are obviously two very, very different drugs that have very different effects, both health effects and, lifetime effects. So we'd have to really look into that to see if it's truly a comparable thing.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Megan, again. So we are moving on to our next presentation. From Dr. Christina Peterson, who is from University of Manitoba, and she will actually talk to us about coping style and risk factors for problematic alcohol use.
My name is Dr. Christina Peterson. I am currently in my 3rd year as a resident doctor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Manitoba. I will be presenting findings from a study that we completed on coping style as a risk factor for problematic alcohol use. This is a 16-year longitudinal study from a Canadian military sample based on data from the Canadian Armed Forces and Veterans Mental Health Follow-up Survey. I'd like to thank the Canadian Institute for Military and Veterans Health Research for the opportunity to share this presentation with all of you today. My primary supervisor for this project is Dr. Murray Enns, professor and most recent former head of the Department of Psychiatry at the Max Rady College of Medicine, University of Manitoba. He currently holds positions of staff psychiatrist and medical director of Operational Stress Injury Clinic in Winnipeg, Manitoba, as well as working in adjunct as scientist for the Manitoba Centre for Health Policy. Next slide. Faculty and presenter disclosures, none. Next slide. With regards to disclosures of commercial supports, the survey data in this study was initially collected by Statistics Canada. Data collected was financially supported by the Canadian Institute of Health Research Foundation grant, as well as the Department of National Defence. There has been no other commercial supports received from any organization or persons other than those mentioned above. Next slide. There are no potential conflicts of interest within this program. Next slide. Mitigating potential bias. As mentioned, the opinions expressed in the study do not represent the views of Statistics Canada. The analysis of this data is under the sole role and discretion of the authors. Statistics Canada and the Canadian Institute of Health Research Foundation and the Department of National Defence had no role in the design, analysis, interpretation, or publication of this study. Next slide. Ethics approval for the surveys conducted by the Canadian Government, Statistics Canada, can be found at the following URL. Data can only be accessed as specific criteria are met following approved applications to the Canadian Research Data Centre. Next slide. Learning objectives. By the end of the session, participants will be able to first distinguish adaptive and maladaptive forms of coping as they relate to an individual's vulnerability towards developing an alcohol use disorder, and also become aware of the potential opportunity to reduce future difficulty with alcohol use in the Canadian Forces and personnel by targeting skills building and problem-focused coping techniques. Next slide. So what we do know is that among Canadian Armed Forces personnel, there's an increased prevalence of substance use disorders. In addition to this, it is estimated that there's about a 2 to 5-fold increase in mental health diagnosis in individuals with substance use disorders. So why is this? One explanation for which there is an increasing amount of evidence is a self-medication hypothesis. A self-medication hypothesis suggests that individuals may actually begin using substances periodically in an effort to cope with symptoms of either a psychiatric disorder or unbearable emotional states. Next slide. Our hypothesis is that coping through self-medication or avoidance are likely to increase the odds of developing an alcohol-related disorder 16 years later, while problem-focused coping is likely to reduce the odds of having an alcohol-related disorder 16 years down the road. So let's talk about why we have indicated that there's a 16-year time frame that we're looking at and how the data is collected. The primary goal of our study was to identify baseline coping techniques that may predispose service members and veterans towards developing alcohol problems over 16 years during a follow-up period. Currently, there's limited longitudinal evidence as to whether coping styles put an individual at greater long-term risk for developing substance use disorders. Next slide. So data from the Canadian Armed Forces and Veterans Mental Health Survey is a longitudinal survey, and the data was essentially collected at 2 points in time. Initial data was gathered in 2002 from the Canadian Community Health Survey, Canadian Forces Supplement, and then a 16-year national representative follow-up survey was conducted in 2018, which is the Canadian Armed Forces and Veterans Mental Health Survey. Our current study utilizes data collected from 2,941 Canadian Armed Forces regular force personnel who participated in both the initial baseline survey in 2002, as well as the follow-up survey in 2018. Next slide, please. So what constituted problematic alcohol use? Assessment of DSM for mental disorders and alcohol use disorders were completed using the World Health Organization, WHO, Composite International Diagnostic Interview by trained interviewers from Statistics Canada. Particular outcomes of interest in our study included measures of alcohol abuse, alcohol dependence, or a new diagnosis of alcohol use disorder after the initial interview in 2002 until follow-up in 2018. Additional outcome variables included binge drinking, defined as 5 or more drinks on one occasion, alcohol abuse, alcohol dependence, or a combination of alcohol abuse and dependence over the past year leading up to the follow-up interview in 2018. Individuals with a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder at baseline in 2002 were not included in the study. And we can move on to the next slide. In order to determine an individual's primary method of coping, measures of different coping styles were derived from the Ways of Coping questionnaire, the COPE scale, and the Coping Strategy Indicator. Initially, participants were asked 14 questions about how they used a variety of techniques to deal with stress. An example of this would be when dealing with stress, how often do you use drugs or medication? Answers were reported on a 5-point Likert scale from never to often, and factor analysis was used to determine a combination of items that resulted in 3 distinct coping styles. A, problem-focused coping, B, avoidance coping, and C was coping through self-medication. Next slide. We then used logistic regression analysis to examine the relationship between baseline coping style in 2002 and subsequent patterns of alcohol dependence and abuse at follow-up in 2018. Odds ratios were calculated for 7 different patterns of alcohol use based on coping strategy. Next slide. This first table here shows unadjusted associations between 2002 coping measures, well, compared to alcohol dependence and abuse measures from 2002 to 2018. You can see the alcohol use measures along the y-axis, while coping measures are on the top along the x-axis. Level of significance was set to 0.05, 0.01, and 0.001. As you can see, the results demonstrate a very strong association between the use of self-medication as a coping mechanism and sustained alcohol dependence or abuse over the following 16 years. Next slide. So that's fine, but what about confounding factors, relationships to alternative variables? The second table again demonstrates associations between coping measures at baseline and alcohol dependence and abuse measures in 2018. Impressively, even when adjusting for baseline demographics, including sex, age, race, marital status, rank, income, education, military environment, in addition to other coping mechanisms, we see a persistent, significant, and very strong association between the use of self-medication as a coping strategy and sustained patterns of substance use 16 years later, which is actually quite incredible. Strikingly, in both data sets, self-medication most strongly predicted a diagnosis of alcohol use disorder over the next 16 years. Next slide. So what do the results of this study tell us? The findings of this study suggest that self-medication, when used as an individual's primary coping strategy, can actually be used to predict a number of different patterns of problematic alcohol use 16 years later. Self-medication also appears to be most highly predictive of a subsequent diagnosis of alcohol use disorder over this time period. Next slide. What is the bottom line here? The bottom line is that these study results illustrate the importance of routinely asking individuals whether or not they have ever felt the need to use prescription drugs, over-the-counter medications, alcohol, and/or other substances in efforts to cope with their symptoms. This may have an even larger implication when we consider the stresses experienced by military personnel following deployment, trauma exposure, as well as when transitioning from active duty to veteran status. This is of particular importance given that early intervention strategies, including skills-based or problem-focused therapies, appear to actually reduce the risk of problematic alcohol use, potentially decades into the future. The strong associations demonstrated in this work further underscore the need to encourage our Canadian Forces members to avoid coping through self-medication during times of stress. And perhaps this is even more applicable now, given our current global situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. Next slide. The findings of the study are clearly of vital importance to Canadian Armed Forces personnel. Yet, at the same time, one must consider the results of this study may not necessarily extend towards representation at the level of the general population, given that the sample population was limited to military personnel. The existence of recall error or recall bias should also be considered, especially given the amnestic effects of alcohol use over time. Multiple assessments over a longitudinal period would allow for a more detailed and accurate characterization between the variables of interest, which may extend beyond alcohol use to include other substances as well. Next slide. I would like to acknowledge and thank the co-authors on our research team, as mentioned, Dr. Murray Enns, Dr. James Bolton, Dr. Shaylee Bolton, Meredith Seeger, Dr. Natalie Moda, Dr. Tracy Afifi, and Dr. Jitender Sareen, as well as the Canadian Armed Forces and Veterans Mental Health Follow-up Survey investigators. Next slide. Thank you for the opportunity to share this presentation with you today. This is a list of references. And next slide. I would now love to open the floor to any questions or further discussion. And final slide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Peterson, for this very, very interesting, clinically very relevant presentation on alcohol consumption in the Canadian Armed Forces. I actually do have a question to you that giving the high comorbidity of alcohol use disorder with other psychiatric disorders, what specific aspects would you feel are the most important to target first in order to help recovery?
That's an excellent question. Thank you very much. So we know that in particular in the Canadian Armed Forces, there's an extremely elevated risk of substance use and alcohol use, particularly in individuals with comorbid psychiatric conditions. So when you are comparing the general, there was a study done about 7 years ago that compared the aspects of the general population. It was sort of limited in their sample to Canadian Armed Forces personnel. They actually initially found higher rates in the Canadian Armed Forces personnel, but when they matched the general population for controlling for sex and other demographics in military personnel, they actually found a higher prevalence of alcohol use disorder in general in the general population. It's in particular that we see this difficulty when we have people coming, returning from deployment. There's a number of studies of individuals returning from deployment in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder and alcohol use disorder just absolutely skyrocket. So as far as just returning to your question, I wanted to give a little bit more background there. We know from the literature on co-occurring disorders, which is the existence of substance use disorder in addition to a psychiatric disorder, so major depressive disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder. we know from many studies that initially a combination of motivational interviewing and cognitive behavioral therapy techniques were used, which were very successful. What we're seeing now actually is Marcia Linehan's dialectical behavioral therapy has been focused specifically on co-occurring disorders, so psychiatric disorders, not necessarily personality disorders. Initially, she was looking at personality, but it seems that these same skill deficits, which we see in coping, is present in individuals with personality disorders, but it's also present in individuals who are not able to cope with the symptoms they're experiencing. So that therapy in particular, I would highly recommend. And also, we know from the literature that addressing both substance use and the psychiatric condition at the same time is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer. And now it's time to have our second break. So I would like you to restart again. We are in 12:23, so in 5 minutes, 12:28. So see you in 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
So welcome back, everyone. We are at the last portion of our presentations in the session. We will have 3 more to go. And the first one will be by Dr. Jenny Liu, who is from the McDonald Franklin Operational Stress Injury Research Center and Western University. Welcome.
Hi, everyone. It's such a pleasure for me to be here today at the CIMVHR Virtual Forum 2021. My name is Jenny Liu, and I will be presenting the effectiveness of psychotherapy and pharmacotherapy for post-traumatic stress disorder in military populations. It's a meta-analysis and systematic review, and today I'll be overviewing the protocol that we are taking to conduct this review. Before I begin, so full disclosure, I have no relationships with any source of commercial interests, and there are no biases that I'm aware of, and the potential sources of biases are mitigated through large consultations and collaborations with our National Advisory Council on this project. We meet on a monthly basis and discuss all the project-related issues, plan our milestones, discuss findings and implications with a large group of people, and so that act as a way to balance out any potential biases that we might hold. We did receive financial support to conduct our research from the Center for Excellence on Post-Traumatic Stress Disorder and Related Mental Health Conditions, as well as from St. Joseph Foundation, just in the form of research funding, and there's no declared potential conflicts of interest with that. And before I begin, I just want to overview the learning objectives for today's session. The first is to identify the steps taken to conduct a comprehensive meta-analysis that examines the effectiveness of psychotherapies and pharmacotherapies in treating PTSD in military and veteran populations. And the second objective that I hope you take away from today is to describe the considerations and challenges in treatment selection based on different types of individual characteristics, treatment characteristics, and clinical characteristics. A little bit of background about why we're doing this review. So studies have estimated that the rates of PTSD in military populations are greater than and higher than those of general civilians. And this is due to, in part, their more higher risk or higher rates of exposure to potentially traumatic events, things like combat, deployment. And not only that, military and veteran populations, because of their exposure, are also experiencing different types of PTSD, so different symptom clusters, different ways of that their PTSD experiences are different than those of civilians. And as a result of these differences, the way that they even respond to treatment might be different. And so when we are engaging in treatment planning for veterans and military populations with PTSD, we can't necessarily take the same set of evidence-based approaches that work for general civilians and assume that they're similarly effective. And indeed, although there's a wide range of evidence-based treatments that are available to treat PTSD, the reviews of their evidence are mixed when it comes to military and veteran populations. Some have found that psychotherapies are more effective. Some have found that pharmacotherapies are more effective. Some have found that there are no differences. And largely, the nuanced picture of why or how we can better make informed decisions regarding treatment planning are still largely unresolved. So we set out to then substantiate the evidence of treatment approaches that are available and really look at the different types of approaches and their overall effectiveness in treating military-related PTSD in our review. For this presentation, I'll overview the different protocols that we'll be taking to conduct our review, starting with a search strategy, the eligibility criteria that we apply to our review, the anticipated outcomes and what we hope that our review will answer, and finally discuss some of the challenges and considerations that we've encountered to date. Our review is still ongoing. We began earlier this year and finalized our search term on April 14. So to conduct this search, we actually identified several representative sets of research that are published from different databases and different journals, and we use that as a guideline for looking at how representative and how appropriate and how precise our search strategy was in capturing all of those studies. And after trial and error, we hit 100% using the follow strategy, which is first to search for treatment or trial or intervention to capture that treatment set of research, then to search for military combat soldiers or veterans to target our specific population group, and then finally to specify PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder to capture the clinical focus of our search. We then combined those three searches and looked at the overlap and restricted the date to 1980, which is when PTSD started showing up in DSM. For eligibility criteria, we applied a pretty broad eligibility. We didn't want to unnecessarily exclude studies from in our review. So we included studies if they had adult populations that were either military or veteran that had some type of diagnosis of PTSD using either the DSM or the ICD. We included studies that offered any type of treatment or intervention, whether psychological, pharmacological, alternative emerging, or any other form that really targeted the PTSD. And we looked for studies that had any type of continuous data that measured PTSD symptom change from before the treatment to after the treatment, or just simply capturing that change through a change score. Because of our wide inclusion criteria, we apply the search strategy through 5 databases, including PsycInfo, Medline, Embase, CINO, and ProQuest Dissertation and Theses. Our initial yield was 19,783 studies that were found through this strategy, and after deduplicating that, we ended up with over 12,000 records, 12,002 to be precise. So we started our title and abstract screening with the 12,002, and after applying our eligibility criteria, we ended up with 1,469 that are currently being reviewed for eligibility by looking at their full text. So it's quite a number of articles we're going through, and we're currently at about 70% complete. We anticipate that we'll complete review by the end of September and hopefully wrap up the project by end of the year. We anticipate that to conduct this research, we'll end up with a large database of available evidence on the treatments that are available for military-related PTSD. What I mean by that is not only are we hoping to capture the effectiveness and changes in symptoms as a result of different treatments, but we also hope to capture a very rich data set about the types of populations that are involved in these studies, the type of symptoms targeted, the types of treatment modalities available, how they're being delivered, and what kinds of secondary outcomes or what kinds of ways that the studies are being conducted and how they might be influencing outcomes. So we hope to get that very rich database as a result. And in addition to that, we also want to evaluate the quality of the evidence on military-related PTSD. In particular, we want to focus on two hallmarks of quality. One is intervention fidelity, or the quality that the intervention is being carried out, adherence to protocol, competence of clinicians and such. And another is the quality of the research itself. So how rigorous that research is being carried out, whether it's randomization, whether it's double blinding, whether studies were sufficiently powered and had enough participants in the representativeness of their sample. And some of the potential questions then that we hope our research will answer is largely mapped out in this slide here. We hope to answer questions related to effectiveness of treatment, research rigor, intervention quality, and overall state of the evidence on areas of addressing PTSD symptom change, on treatment considerations when we're engaging in treatment planning, and finally, considerations as applied to the population that we are treating. For example, we hope to answer questions like how effective are the treatments and how might that be changed based on the type of tools that we're using to measure PTSD. For example, there's clinician-administered measures. There's also self-report measures. How might the evidence on effectiveness differ as a result of the different ways that we measure PTSD? And when it comes to the research regarding the PTSD symptom change, then how might the quality of research influence the overall effectiveness that we're finding? And as related to intervention, then are there differences in studies based on whether an intervention is trauma-informed or whether it's an intervention using evidence-based therapies or an intervention that is quite novel and not having a lot of evidence behind it? Are there differences in their effectiveness? And tying all that together, then we can begin to map out a picture of the relative effectiveness of various interventions in treating military-related PTSD. When it comes to treatment considerations, we want to answer, how might combination treatments versus single treatments versus augmentations influence the effectiveness of different therapies or different treatment modalities. For example, as an individual coming in, if I am already receiving some sort of pharmacological intervention to treat my depression symptoms, and now I am engaging in psychotherapy to treat my PTSD, how might that change the way that I can expect my symptoms to change as a result of partaking in this treatment? And so we hope that with the large amount of evidence we are collecting, we hope to kind of better understand those nuances. And carrying that over into research, then we hope that we can begin to see research that mimics more real life scenarios. So sometimes research is conducted in very clear, with clear exclusion criteria and washouts implemented. For example, you can't have participated in prior treatment or have received any type of treatment or be on any type of drugs. And that's the only way that you can participate in this intervention research. How might that be different and the evidence from those studies be different than studies that look more like real life, right? That someone can be coming in with multiple comorbidities, whether it's physical comorbidities or mental comorbidities. How might that influence treatment efficacy overall? and the factors of intervention implementation, such as the way that interventions are delivered, whether it's in person, whether it's online like this, or through telehealth or mobile services or digital services, how might that influence the way that interventions are effective or are not effective? And taking that together, we hope to identify the influential factors that treatment providers should consider when engaging in treatment planning. And finally, for population considerations, I really want to just consider the nuances for who are these interventions most effective, whether it's gender, whether it's related to age, to PTSD symptom clusters, whether it's due to trauma type, for which group are what types of treatments most efficacious or appropriate or tolerated. Some challenges that we've encountered along the way. Of course, anytime engaging in large-scale reviews, we do tend to see lots of heterogeneities in the literature, and ours is no different. We hope that with the large data set we are collecting, we'll be able to at least make some sense of those various variabilities in the literature. We're also encountering complexities of patient populations, patients with different kinds of comorbidities, different age groups, different gender, different types of deployments, and we hope that we can make sense of that. Another consideration is to really tease apart whether an intervention is effective as a result of the true design of the intervention or the true theoretical basis of the intervention, or the way that it might be delivered. For example, group therapy versus individual therapy, the effectiveness of in-person versus digital like this. And last but not least, an important consideration is anytime working with a special population that is hard to reach, they typically, when engaging in research, are engaging in large-scale research studies, multi-year longitudinal studies. And so how do we then make sure that we're not overestimating effects or overrepresenting certain populations, and ensuring that the studies are capturing representative samples of military and veteran populations? And with that, I would like to conclude my presentation and thank my research team and co-authors at the McDonald-Franklin OSI Research Center, at our National Advisory Center of Excellence, PTSD, and also all the other collaborators that have advised on this project. And those are the references that I've used in my presentation. And with that, thank you so much for this opportunity to present at the CIMVHR Virtual Forum, and I look forward to connecting with you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Liu, for this excellent presentation, and congratulations for this huge and very complex undertaking in this very, very well needed area. And congratulations, I'm aware that since you recorded the presentation that the review is completed. So again, congratulations for that. We do have a question. Given that DSM and ICD have slightly different diagnostic structures for PTSD, are you accounting for how these differences might affect outcomes in the different studies being reviewed as part of the meta-analysis?
Thank you so much, Lieutenant Colonel, and it's great to see you and connect about this project again. So a great question on that distinguishing factor between the DSM and the ICD, and also even in between iterations of the DSM and ICD, we do see some minor updates and changes. So one of the areas that we are particularly interested in further exploring is to look at the moderating role of the diagnostic criteria as applied. And that extends to even looking at the time of the study, what was the diagnostic tool used, and also what was the measurement tool, and whether that tool was constructed in association with the diagnostic criteria. And then kind of tease apart those differences and look at whether that contributes to the different effectiveness that we're finding with different treatment approaches over time.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question is that does your meta-analysis take into account the effect of treatment dropout in the different studies?
Yes, so we are looking at the different types of treatment outcomes and treatment dropouts. I just want to clarify that the question was about treatment dropouts?
Yes, treatment dropouts, yes.
So the treatment dropouts is actually a really interesting area that we want to look at, because not all the studies will disclose the dropouts, and some will be more about a tolerability rate, some will be documenting the specific number of participants that dropped out, and also the reasons why certain participants have dropped out. So in our effort to be very comprehensive, we're hoping to capture at least the rates of dropout. So looking at and converting that to a general tolerability sort of indicator that we can use as a moderator for our analyses. But then also looking at what are some of the reasons for dropout. And if there's room for that, we can begin to categorize those into the different buckets in our moderation analyses.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. There is one more question that what has been the biggest challenge in conducting this type of meta-analysis?
You know, it should really be what hasn't been a challenge, right? But I guess the biggest challenge, and tying it back to Ashley's presentation earlier about looking at the different type of treatment approaches and what is really effective. So Ashley mentioned finding that in her systematic review that a combination of psychotherapy and drug therapy typically is effective. And what we want to do is to give a more nuanced picture to that, is really, you know, what are those combinations? If that is the case, that combinations are more effective, is it in a way that is added on? Is it in a way that is adjunctive? And also not all psychotherapies or drug therapies are the same. So for example, if one drug side effect influences the way that you are able to be sociable to others, and then in your therapy, you are asked to, you know, engage with a group, and those two are kind of directly interfering, or at least interacting with each other, right? What are those interactions? So we really want to try and map that out, or at least begin to tap into some of those nuances. And that's kind of also the challenging part.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Dr. Liu. And now we are moving on to our next presentation to Dr. Lorraine Smith-McDonald, who is from the Heroes in Mind Advocacy Research Consortium and University of Alberta. And she will share us her finding about a very exciting new treatment modality for PTSD, CIMVHR.
Hello, everyone. It's my pleasure to be presenting to you today on behalf of my co-authors, Dr. Jones, Brown, Pike, Bramell-Phillips, and Vermeten, about our ongoing clinical trial on CIMVHR for treatment-resistant PTSD and moral injury in military members and veterans. Just to share with you, obviously, my name is Lorraine. I am a postdoctoral fellow in the Heroes in Mind Advocacy and Research Consortium at the University of Alberta. We also do want to share that we do have some commercial interests, in the sense that this study has been funded by a number of different grants, including through the Glen Rose Rehabilitation Hospital Foundation, the Royal Canadian Legion, Alberta Northwest Territories Command, and the IDEAS grant through the Department of National Defence, Government of Canada. However, that being said, I do not have any disclosures of commercial support, potential for conflicts of interest, or mitigating potential bias. What I hope to do today in this very short 15-minute presentation is to be able to provide with you a quick overview of what CIMVHR is, a description of our study, and a presentation of our preliminary results in relation to treatment-resistant PTSD, moral injury, and to explore the impact of CIMVHR for the clinicians and operators who have been delivering this intervention. Very quickly, for those of you who are not familiar with CIMVHR, CIMVHR stands for Motion Assisted Multimodal memory desensitization and reconsolidation, also known as 3MDR. 3MDR is an innovative and technology-based exposure therapy trauma that holds promise for treating both PTSD and moral injury. As a multimodal trauma therapy, this system uses both invasive virtual reality and includes a treadmill and a large screen format that encompasses about 240 degrees. Previous studies and our own have been delivered in rehabilitation hospitals that have used a Karen system, so a computer-assisted rehabilitation environment. As you can see in this photo, what will happen is that the participant will stand in the middle of the room on a treadmill where the therapist or therapists are then strapped in beside them, while an operator sits back about 2 meters to support and run the entire system. How 3MDR works as a therapy is very simple. It consists of 3 phases, including a pre-platform phase, a platform phase, and a post-platform phase. For this study, participants participated in 6 90-minute sessions. Very quickly, in the pre-platform phase, participants select the images they will look at, along with listening to pre-selected music that reminds them of their trauma. In the platform phase, participants view 7 images for 3 to 5 minutes each. As the participant views these images, they recall associated traumatic events or potentially morally injurious events, together with physical sensations, emotions, and thoughts. As in with EMDR, a virtual ball displaying number which the participant reads out is then displayed across that image before the new image appears. Finally, in the post-platform phase, participants are removed from the platform off the treadmill, and the therapist and the participant are able to discuss and describe what they learned, what they hope to accomplish in the next session, and create a self-care plan. In this, 3MDR includes exposure to visual stimuli and auditory input, walking, a dual attention task, and a therapeutic context and relationship. Multiple studies using 3MDR amongst military and veteran populations have been noted in the Netherlands, the United Kingdom, the United States, and Canada, and all of these have shown promise. For example, all have shown a decrease in PTSD symptom severity from baseline to endpoint, and have been noted to have significantly greater impact in those in controls, with medium to large effect size. These effects have also been maintained post the conclusion of the 3MDR intervention. So, regarding our own study, our protocol is available online, and so I won't spend a lot of time speaking about this. However, what I want to note is that our study was purposely built to both expand the current knowledge we have about treatment-resistant 3MDR and the effect on treatment-resistant PTSD, and also to add 2 other unique components. This was the exploration of 3MDR for moral injury, and as stated, the impact of delivering 3MDR for therapists and operators. To explore this first element of our study, we used standardized clinical measures that were administered both at baseline, pre each session, and then longitudinally at 1, 3, and 6 months. A list of the clinical measures are available in front of you. Additionally, just to note, biological data was also collected at these times, and results of this will be forthcoming. Finally, data was analyzed according to standard statistical tests appropriate with the sample size. For our second question, looking at moral injury, we selected the Moral Injury Symptom Scale, or the MIS. This scale was selected at the time of the beginning of the study in 2019 because it was one of the few scales that were available that specifically addressed moral injury in military members, and also that addressed symptoms and not exposure. Additionally, we also used qualitative data to assess the success of a 3MDR for treatment of moral injury, and this qualitative data consisted of analysis of the sessions, the post debriefs, that platform C component, and the post-intervention interviews. Finally, for that third and final piece, looking at the role of 3MDR therapists and operators, we conducted semi-structured interviews with therapists and operators who delivered 3MDR in the Netherlands, Canada, and the United States. Here again, this data was thematically analyzed. Just quickly before we get into the results, just to show you a little bit about the demographic information to date. The key takeaways here is to note that for the 3MDR participants themselves, they were predominantly male, they were non-commissioned members, they had all been deployed, and more importantly, they all had experienced treatment-resistant PTSD. Regarding the demographics for the therapists and operators, here, interestingly, we had a balance between men and women from a variety of healthcare professions and also represented all 4 countries that are currently running 3MDR studies. So let's get into the results. Looking at the results of the impact of 3MDR on PTSD symptoms, we were excited and delighted to show that our results are in line with other previous studies showing that 3MDR did have an impact on PTSD symptoms. This included both the PCL-5 and the CAPS total symptom scale. Additionally, statistical significant changes were also noted in the PHQ-9 score for depression symptoms, the GAD-7 score for anxiety symptoms, the DERS-18 for emotional regulation, the OQ-45 for social functioning, and the CDRS-25 for resiliency. When we also looked qualitatively at this, what we noticed was that participants did validate this and experienced a decrease of these PTSD symptoms through a variety of mechanisms of 3MDR. In particular, a couple of key pieces, which we've noted in green, were experienced by nearly all of the members. First, 3MDR was noted to be extremely immersive. And so participants noted that they were unable to, in a safe way, avoid traumas that they had previously tried to do so. They also noted a type of breaking out where they were able to finally be able to acknowledge and express emotions, thoughts, and sensations related to their traumatic memories. Finally, in terms of the successful components, they also noted that tailored immersion, being able to select the images and the music, and having a therapist stand right beside them as almost an active fire team partnership was incredibly meaningful. The results for our second question on moral injury were also equally as fascinating and exciting to see. We examined statistical relationships between changes in the MIS overall scale over time and with other questionnaires, including the CAPS-5. And when we did this, we found that the scores were significantly related, again, to the PCL-5 score, the PHQ-9 score, the GAD-7 score, the OQ-45, the PDEQ score, and the CDRS resiliency score, along with the CAPS-5 total score and the CAPS-5 re-experiencing, avoidance, and hypoarousal score. Some of these scores are noted on the screen for you. Again, when we looked at the qualitative data and triangulated this, these results were further substantiated. For example, it was noted within the qualitative data that participants noted an overall improvement in their moral injury symptoms. In particular, participants frequently described to us that they had not shared their potentially morally injurious events in previous trauma therapy, and that the inability to do this, or the ability to do this, was often the turning point in their 3MDR treatment. I'd just like to share a few examples. During 3MDR, participants' narratives offered insight into a number of trauma-related symptoms that differed from PTSD criterion. So for example, while those common experiences of moral injury, such as guilt and shame, what has been proposed as the signature symptoms of moral injury were present, significant other emotions such as horror, contempt, disgust, rage, bitterness, shock, despair, disappointment, worthlessness, regret, and disillusionment were often comorbid and at times more intense. Participants were also deep thinkers who often reported feeling stuck and alone in this liminal and cognitive and existential nightmare of constantly questioning themselves, their world beliefs, their values, their moral compass, and humanity itself. Thus, we felt that central to many participants' moral injury was the unresolved dissonance between what participants perceived to ought to have happened versus what truly did happen. Participants also noted that it was through 3MDR that they were able to give thought and give voice to those unfiltered thoughts and feelings, rather than remaining on autopilot and repeating previous narratives. That is, they were able to lament what they had lost without being judged or needing to protect themselves or those around them, including the therapist, from the contents of these experiences. And so, by allowing themselves to share their messy truths, many participants reported a shift from an ideological either-or worldview to a multifaceted worldview that accepted rather than rejected their messy and often difficult emotional reactions, cognitive dissonance, and fractured world beliefs. In regards to the last and final piece, which was looking at the role of therapists and operators, we also found some very interesting results here. Contrary to our hypotheses, we did not find that therapists and operators indicated that they had experienced more intensive secondary or vicarious trauma. Thus, participants did note that while 3MDR was difficult, and there were often times where the immersive nature of the therapy itself was difficult to avoid, they did not feel that this was any worse than any other form of trauma therapy that many of them have offered, whether that was prolonged exposure therapy, EMDR, or even CPT. Regarding the role of the 3MDR therapist in particular, there was some mixed results regarding whether or not a therapist should come in with previous trauma experience, the level of training, and what other skills might be best fitted. However, what was clear in this data was that for operators, they often felt badly underprepared for the realities of being exposed to trauma therapists. As one participant aptly commented, he was trained to be an engineer, not a trauma therapist, and thus suddenly being thrust into this role of being exposed to many horrific stories was quite shocking and difficult to come to terms to. Additionally, therapists and operators noticed and saw the perceived effects of 3MDR on patients and found that this was often very healing to them to see that their patients and clients were getting better throughout the treatment. And this was one of the ways that they were able to manage some of the stress they experienced. Finally, they also provided some recommendation for future use, which really focused on this idea of mentorship and the need for participants to be able to have mentorship, supervision, collaboration, and ongoing support and self-care as they continue to do the 3MDR therapy, especially if this was done on a regular basis. So what does this all mean? Well, I'd like to leave you with a few discussion and clinical takeaway points. The first and most important that I hope you can take away from this very short presentation on 3MDR is that recovery from treatment-resistant PTSD is possible. While our results are preliminary, and these in collaboration though with our other international partners is showing that symptom reduction of treatment-resistant PTSD is possible. Second, this idea of an active therapy may be important and prove to be more effective and worthy of exploration than what we've traditionally done in a more stationary type format in a clinical setting. Third, as every clinician working with this population will know, military members and veterans are Olympic level experts at avoiding or hiding painful elements of their service that they do not want to talk about. And thus this needs to be explicitly addressed or integrated into all trauma therapies being offered to this population. Fourth, given the above, we would also encourage all clinicians to be aware that special care needs to be taken to make sure that potentially morally injurious events and moral injuries have been discussed, as these experiences and stories are likely to be those which are most hidden, given the extremely painful and personal nature. Our results also highlight that moral injury may be an underlying component of treatment-resistant PTSD, which again needs to be explored further. Fifth, across all 3MDR groups, it was clear that the therapeutic alliance was key. Participants were often moved to tears knowing that their therapist or therapists were standing right there beside them, looking at the same image they were as they recounted their trauma narrative. In this sense, many participants indicated that it was this sense of not being alone that often allowed them to go forward with this difficult and immersive therapy. Finally, despite the intensity of this therapeutic alliance, 3MDR therapists did not suffer secondary or vicarious traumatic stress. However, we also recognize the importance of ongoing training, supervision, and self-care for both the therapist and the operator. Finally, we'd just like to acknowledge and say a huge thank you to all of our team, and also especially to our 3MDR study participants. This study is ongoing, and we look forward to being able to present to you with our final results in a few years. Please see, these are the references, and should you like more contact information about this study, please feel free to reach out to myself or Dr. Suzette Bramell-Phillips, who is the PI, or even just to reach out to Highmark itself, and we'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you for your attention, and I look forward to taking questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lorraine Smith-McDonald, for this excellent presentation. I think all of us agree that we are always very excited to hear about promising innovative treatment modalities for PTSD, specifically for treatment-resistant PTSD. And along those lines, there is a question about actually that how was treatment resistance defined for study recruitment?
Yes, excellent question. So we know that that definition is a little bit loose, but using best practices criterion, our definition was that participants would have had to have had two unsuccessful treatments, two unsuccessful treatments, which could include either 2 psychotherapeutic treatments or a psychotherapeutic plus a pharmacological treatment. And so usually I would say most of the clients that we recruited were persons who had had at least 2, many of them up to 4 or 5 failed treatments. So had usually gone through the standard PE, CPT, even EMDR from from a trauma-focused therapy, and then had tried multiple pharmacological interventions as well.
Thank you. Another question, where does 3EMDR fit in the continuum of care? In terms of cost effectiveness, are the outcomes different than current evidence-based psychotherapy needs and pharmacotherapy?
That's a wonderful question. I think we're still developing it. So 3MDR particularly was developed for treatment-resistant PTSD. And so certainly as it is currently being trialed, I would say that it is in the, if we could say, latter end of the continuum of care. Because these, as I said, I mean, within all of the trials that are being run within these 4 countries, these are participants who effectively have run out of options. They've tried everything else and they've become very stuck. That being said, there is some discussion, because 3MDR is also only 6 sessions. There is some discussion perhaps that maybe rather than being left to the latter end of continuum of care, that maybe it could be or should be moved forward. However, we do certainly recognize that if that were to be the case, there certainly would be some technological and financial investment that would need to incur. Certainly 3MDR is more expensive than something like CPT, which can be done in an office of a therapist. There certainly is a lot more of both sort of instrumental costs and then human resource costs. So currently it is predominantly at the latter end, and it has predominantly been trialed on treatment-resistant PTSD, but there certainly are conversations about maybe moving it to a front-end treatment in the future, should the evidence prove to be going that way.
Thank you very much. And a final question, that how could the 3MDR be potentially applied to other trauma-affected populations, such as people who are impacted by military sexual trauma, refugees, or first responders?
Absolutely. So some of that work is currently underway. So we know that our Netherlands partners are actually currently using 3MDR for refugees and persons impacted by war from a civilian context, so not necessarily being armed combatants themselves. Our own lab is currently just finished a validation study to look at changing the software to actually provide 3MDR for first responders and healthcare providers affected by COVID-19 and or other environmental stressors coming from those jobs. So we are in the process of moving forward in those, and certainly we don't see any reason that the 3MDR couldn't be effective, albeit it's very early on, so I can't say definitively.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much again, Dr. Smith-McDonald. Thank you.
Thank you.
Now we are moving on to our 8th presentation by Dr. Heather McQuaig-Edge, who will talk about the characteristics of recruits in the Canadian Armed Forces.
Hi, I'm Heather McQuaig-Edge. I am a defense scientist working for the Department of National Defense, and today I'll be speaking to you about some of the descriptive results from the 2016 to 2018 Canadian Armed Forces Recruit Health Questionnaire. Before we get started, I have no relationships with commercial interest, no commercial support or conflicts of interest, and no bias to mitigate. At the conclusion of this activity, you should be able to recognize the importance of measuring early career health. You should be able to describe the health and lifestyle of recent Canadian Armed Forces or CAF recruits, and you should have a better understanding of how measuring baseline health can be useful for health promotion and programming. So the bit of background, the Recruit Health Questionnaire is a measure of health information that was measured at baseline when recruits first joined the Canadian Armed Forces. And so it is collected from non-commissioned member NCM recruits or officer candidates who are just starting their basic training. This came about because there was a need to collect better information about pre-military lifestyle and behaviors when recruits first join the CAF and before they go on any deployments. And as a result, this is where the Recruit Health Questionnaire was developed and launched in 2003, and it's been collecting information from recruits ever since then. It has two main research objectives. The first is to monitor trends in the health and characteristics of incoming recruits, to identify health promotion and training needs. And the second objective is to link to subsequent data collected to identify risks and protective factors for various health conditions among CAF members throughout and beyond their careers. As a continuation of the health surveillance activities, the Recruit Health Questionnaire has periodically examined the health and behaviors, psychological dispositions, and social determinants of health over time. And this study represents an exploration of the health and lifestyle of recruits who began basic military training between 2016 and 2018. And it compares these to the health and the lifestyle of the cohorts just preceding them, the 2013 to 2015 cohort. And we also looked at a series of key demographic factors that were examined just within that particular 2016 to 2018 cohort as well. So the survey itself is a voluntary research survey that is offered to Rank Force officer and non-commissioned member candidates undergoing their basic training. So I'll hereafter refer to those both rank groups as recruits. And it's done during the first few weeks of their basic military training at the Canadian Forces Leadership and Recruit School in Saint-Jean, Quebec. It was a paper and pencil survey for 2016 and 2017, and it was an electronic survey in 2018. And it measures general health status and health conditions, so body mass index, mental health, injuries, and the like, health and risk behaviors such as substance use, eating habits, physical activity, personality characteristics, and social environmental determinants of health. The RHQ sample that answered the questionnaires for the 2016 to 2018 sample, there were 10,786 recruits who we received some information from on the RHQ. The majority of the respondents were male, non-commissioned member candidates who were between the ages of 17 to 24 years and spoke English as a first language primarily. The RHQ is a voluntary survey, so it doesn't hit everybody, but the overall response rate is quite good. So since its inception in 2003, it's around 76%, but since going electronic in 2018, response rates have actually increased in averaging around 92%. In terms of some of the results, the recruits are asked to rate their own health on a scale from poor to excellent, and using crude prevalence proportions to compare each cohort group and testing trends with sequential logistic regressions that were adjusted for age and sex. There was a very high proportion of recruits in both cohort groups who rated their health as good, very good, or excellent in both cohorts. There was a small but significant decrease in the proportions in the 2016 to 2018 recruits compared to the previous recruits, even when adjusting for age and sex, but this was quite small, as you can see on the chart. In terms of the recruits' mental health, and these were measured using various screening measures such as the Patient Health Questionnaire 9 for depression, the PHQ for panic disorder and anxiety disorder, and the PCLC for PTSD. And while the proportions were quite low among all recruits for probable mental health conditions, there was a small but significant increase in recruits reporting symptoms of probable mental health problems in the 2016 to 2018 cohort compared with the prior cohort. In terms of their physical health, there were proportionately more recruits in the 2016 to 2018 cohort than the prior cohort, reporting post-concussive and somatic symptoms, but fewer reporting acute injuries. There was also an increase in the proportion of recruits identified as overweight or obese based on their BMI in the 2016 to 2018 cohort, and this was especially true of obesity, but that's captured within that same chart. In terms of their health behaviors, the proportions of recruits who are engaging in frequent alcohol use, regular binge drinking, driving under the influence of alcohol, and smoking tobacco significantly decreased in the 2016 to 2018 cohort compared to the previous group. And these decreases in these particular behaviors reflect more favorable behaviors in the latter cohort group. However, the rates of frequent condom use, healthy eating habits, and physical activity significantly decreased in the latter cohort, and sleep problems increased in the latter cohort group. In terms of psychological disposition, overall, the 2016 to 2018 cohort had relatively favorable psychological dispositions and personality traits, as indicated by some of the figure on the screen of the different traits that were measured. And these are using well-validated scales and the like. In general, and with few exceptions, there was a decrease among the 2016 to 2018 cohort block relative to the 2013 to 2015 cohort block. However, the differences were quite small in magnitude, and it's unclear whether or not such differences might be expected to result in noticeable health changes and well-being. Many of these measures don't have established cutoff scores to establish what is good or bad or concerning or not. And so it's hard to determine whether or not those fluctuations will actually indicate any overall changes. I do want to highlight that this is the first analysis that allowed us to compare cohort groups on risk propensity, which was added to the RHQ in 2013. While it's desirable to have some risk propensity or willingness to engage in risky behaviors for someone who's entering a military career, given the inherent risk in the job, there are certain health and safety risk propensities that can lead to unhealthy decisions and poor health outcomes. These scores are obtained on a scale from 1 to 7, indicating likelihood of engaging in various risky activities, such as drinking heavily at a social function or driving a car without a seatbelt as representative items of health and safety risk, or taking a skydiving class or bungee jumping off of a tall building for recreational risk propensity. So it's one's likelihood of engaging in these kinds of activities. And total scores for each subscale are on a possible range of 7 to 42. So as you can see from the table, for the most part, recruits were moderately likely to engage in recreational risk activities, while they were somewhat unlikely to engage in health and safety risk activities. And there was actually a decrease between the cohort blocks in recreational risk activities, but as you can see, the means are still quite similar. Several differences in physical, mental health and health behaviors were noted between male and female recruits within the 2016 to 2018 recruit. So compared to male recruits within that cohort, The females reported less binge drinking, alcohol use, less smoking, better eating habits, more physical activity, more favorable psychological dispositions, and more social environments. However, females also experienced more somatic symptoms, more repetitive strain injuries, and more anxiety and panic symptoms than males. These patterns of differences by sex for this particular cohort, the 2016 to 2018s, was similar to those for found in earlier analyses for earlier cohorts, but we didn't statistically compare those. There were a few other additional demographic differences that were found within the 2016 to 2018 cohort. Several age differences were found in that younger recruits had higher levels of recreational risk propensity and more acute injuries than older recruits. Fewer younger recruits had overweight or obese BMIs. There was a higher proportion of younger recruits with probable depression and probable PTSD scores than older recruits. And there were more favorable health behaviors, such as less smoking, more frequent condom use, and less alcohol use among the youngest age group, so the 17 to 19-year-olds, compared with any of the older age groups as well. Recruits with less education had favorable physical and mental health, had less favorable physical and mental health, engaged in more frequent binge drinking, were more likely to smoke, and more likely to report problems sleeping than recruits who reported that they had higher education. Recruits reporting less previous year's household income had higher proportions of overweight or obese BMI and reported more somatic symptoms, higher levels of PTSD symptoms, and lower proportions of always using a condom than those reporting higher income. For all the dimensions where rank differences emerged, except for injuries, proportionately more officer candidates than NCM candidates engaged in healthier behaviors, had more favorable psychological dispositions, and more positive social environments. So overall, there was relatively favorable health amongst the 2016 to 2018 cohorts of CAF recruits. They had favorable physical and mental health, engaged in health conscious behaviors for the most part, and had relatively positive psychological dispositions. However, there was a decrease in health status, health behaviors, and psychological dispositions compared to the previous cohort group. This decrease, most notably, there was a decrease in physical activity and an increase in BMI. And the significant difference here might be attributed to measurement issues, as the length of the physical activity section of the RHQ might have led to some fatigue and non-responses, but this was the same measure that was used previously. However, the decrease in physical activity was also mirrored in the increase in BMI in the latter cohort group. And so this might be reflective of similar changes in the Canadian general population, but we haven't examined that further yet. The decrease over time in physical activity and increase in BMI suggests areas that might be targeted, might be considered for targeted health promotion or intervention programming. Some of the demographic differences suggest possible profiles for targeted health promotion or health monitoring. And so to ensure that those who might be at particular risk for certain health conditions or health behaviors might be able to get the attention that they might need that can adjust that. And continuing to assess and monitor the health-related factors using the RHQ can provide valuable information that can help identify candidates at risk for health problems early in their careers or later throughout as well. The RHQ does have a few limitations. It is a self-reported survey, so the data cannot be objectively validated against any other measures. It is voluntary, so we have to be careful about generalizing to the entire recruit population, but given our high response rates, we're pretty careful with that. And then we also have to recognize that there is statistical significance versus clinical significance, and we do have a large sample size, so that does result in a number of statistically significant findings, but whether or not that translates to clinical significance or meaningful significance depends on the factor and what we want to do with it. Some future directions that we are planning with the RHQ is to continue to monitor recruit health trends and trends over time, and to provide complementary data to integrate into other studies as well, and continue to link it with other data sets and other administrative or health data within the CAF for future studies as well. It has changed. The addition of cannabis measures in 2019 will allow for monitoring of pre-enrollment cannabis use for surveillance and observation purposes. So those will be covered in the next the next periodic assessment. So in conclusion, the recruits who enrolled between 2016 and 2018 had relatively favorable health profiles, albeit slightly less favorable than the 2013 to 2015 recruit cohorts. But these results continue to provide support for the value of strengthening policies and relevant health promotion initiatives and in ensuring that the CAF supports their personnel from the beginning of their careers and beyond. So I'm just going to flip to my references slide in case anyone wants to take those down. And I'm happy to take any questions and would like to acknowledge my colleague as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. McQuaig-Edge, for this excellent presentation. And as you said, that this information, it's very, very relevant to develop in the Canadian Armed Forces, the preventative and early interventions for those young individuals. Thank you. We do have a question. Is there interest in shifting to a gender rather than sex perspective with a third gender option, like non-binary, in future Canadian Armed Forces Recruit Health Questionnaire?
Yes, absolutely. I saw that come through on the chat. And I want to let you know that for sure we have actually made some changes and additions to the Recruit Health Questionnaire. I think in 2018, we did add an alternative, a third option, as well as a prefer not to identify, but that number was quite small, so we weren't able to do any statistical analyses or look at that group separately. And then even since then, we have now moved to a separate biological sex question, as well as a more inclusive gender identity question in future iterations. So it is something that we are conscious of and aware of. So we are moving in that direction, but unfortunately that was not available at the time when we were using for this particular analysis.
Thank you. Thank you. There is another question. Would you be kind enough to explain why this analysis uses BMI as a benchmark?
I'm not quite sure what that the BMI is. BMI is one of the measures that's captured, and so that's what we have as our assessment of mass and weight at the time. We have, it is a self-report questionnaire, so we can't, and it is a survey that's done sort of en masse, so we can't unfortunately get waist circumference or other measures of weight or health in that sense. So we do have to use BMI for that. It is what we have. So unfortunately, that's what we have. And there are ways that we potentially could link it with other more validated measures. But again, because it is a survey, it is a self-reported questionnaire. We are cognizant that people tend to report that they're taller and thinner than usual. So I know that there is discussion about moving towards a correction. I believe on many sort of Statistics Canada reports, they also do a correction and have some algorithms to allow for a correction for BMI and for that self-reported nature of it. So we are talking about considering using something similar to try and adjust for that and adjust for the bias that might be available or might occur because of that.
Thank you very much. So thank you very much, Dr. McQuaig-Edge. And actually, we are done with all of our 8 presentations. So this is time to wrap up this session. And I would like to thank again for every single researchers for their great work and very thought-provoking presentation during this morning. And also I would like to thank for the audience for the interesting questions and the great discussions what we had. I'm confident that most of us, after hearing those presentations, inspired to learn more about these topics, what we talked about today. And I really hope that in the near future, we will see of the fruits of your research, of your work in a clinical aspect in the Canadian Armed Forces. Again, thank you very much. And thank you very much again for CIMVHR for putting together this great session. And also thank you very much for all of the technical support we got during this morning.
Thank you all for joining us on day one of CIMVHR Virtual Forum. I want to extend a special thank you to Colonel Homer Tien and Lieutenant Colonel Andrea Tuca. Your leadership in moderating today's session was exceptional. To the researchers who presented today, thank you for the time and effort you put into educating all of us on your important research findings. We have all learned so much from you today. I would also like to encourage all of you to submit your research to CIMVHR's journal, the Journal of Military, Veteran, and Family Health. Details on how to do this can be found on the CIMVHR website under Publications. I would also like to take a moment to thank two new CIMVHR Forum sponsors. Platinum sponsor, the Canadian Institute for Public Safety, Research and Treatment, also known as CIPCERT, and gold sponsor, Canadian Cannabis Clinics. We are grateful for your support and for your commitment to serving those who serve us. Please take some time to visit all the sponsor booths in the conference platform. I look forward to seeing everyone next Thursday, October 14th, for day 2 of oral presentations that will focus on the veteran population. To all of you and your families, please stay safe and be well. Thank you.